Welcome to our channel. Please hit the subscribe button so that you'll be notified whenever our new video comes out. Mrs. SEN'S is a short story by Jhumpa Lahiri, included in her collection of short stories titled Interpreter of Maladies, which won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 2000. Ever since his school year started, Elliot has been going to Mrs. SEN'S house after school. Even though he's 11 and can take care of himself, his mom wants someone to look after him. The first time Elliot goes there, he's surprised by the big pile of shoes by the door and the covered furniture. Mr. SEN, who's a math teacher, tells Elliot's mom that Mrs. SEN will learn to drive by December. But Mrs. SEN says she's not great at it and she had a chauffeur back in her country, India. When she hears India, she gets all emotional. Elliot likes watching Mrs. SEN cook. He's fascinated by a special curved knife from India that she uses to cut veggies efficiently. But he's not allowed in the kitchen because she worries he might get hurt. She tells Elliot that back in India, knives were a big deal and lots of women would cook together for weddings. But in America, it's quiet and she's alone. When Elliot's mom comes to pick him up, Mrs. SEN cleans up all the cooking stuff. Elliot's mom doesn't seem comfortable in the apartment and doesn't want the food Mrs. SEN offers. But when they're home, she has wine and orders pizza often. Elliot likes being at Mrs. SEN'S place because it's warm, unlike their chilly beach house. He and his mom live alone in a beach house, and now that it's cold, the beach feels lonely and scary. Mrs. SEN asks Elliot if anyone would come if she screamed. In her home country, people would come for even small things. Elliot remembers a party they weren't invited to, and he thinks maybe someone might call to complain. He starts to understand that home means India for Mrs. SEN, not where they are now. He asks her about the red powder in her hair, and she says it's like a wedding ring that won't get lost. Every day, Mrs. SEN comes to the bus stop early to meet Elliot. They practice driving together in her car. Driving makes Mrs. SEN anxious and distracted, especially on the main road where other cars are. She wonders if things will get better once she has her license, like Mr. SEN says. One day, Mrs. SEN receives a happy letter from her home country. She shares with Elliot that her sister has become a mother to a baby girl. But she's a bit sad that the baby will be 3 years old by the time she gets to meet her. Mrs. SEN wonders if Elliot misses his mom every day, but he admits he's never really felt that way. Mrs. SEN is happy when she gets fresh fish because she can use them in Indian dishes. She compares the fish here to those back in Calcutta and thinks the ones here aren't as good. She reserves fish at a market by the beach, but one day, Mr. SEN says he can't get the fish anymore because he's busy. Mrs. SEN tells Elliot that she's not happy in America, even though her family thinks she must be content and rich. Later, Mr. SEN changes his mind and takes Mrs. SEN and Elliot to the fish market. In November, Mrs. SEN stops cooking and practicing driving. She's quiet and forgetful. She plays Elliot a tape of her family talking about the day she left India. She translates it for him. The next day, she plays the tape again but stops at her grandfather's voice. He has passed away. A week later, she starts cooking again. Mr. SEN takes Elliot and his wife to the market and they buy a lot of fish. Mrs. SEN enjoys the cold weather and laughs a lot that day. She even lets them take a picture of her and dine at a restaurant. Mr. SEN asks Mrs. SEN to drive back, but she panics around other cars and stops driving after that. After this, Mrs. SEN decides to learn the bus route so she can take Elliot to the fish market. On the way, they talk about what Elliot will do when his mom gets older. On their way back, a lady on the bus complains about the fish smell. The bus driver calls her out, and Mrs. SEN feels embarrassed. A few days later, when the next batch of fish comes, Mrs. SEN tells Elliot to get ready. She takes Elliot in the car to the market. But things go wrong really fast. Another driver startles her, and she crashes the car into a telephone pole. They're not seriously hurt, but the car's fender needs fixing. Mr. SEN comes when the police call and talks things out. He explains she doesn't have a driver's license. He takes them back home. Mrs. SEN fixes a snack for Elliot and hides in her room where Elliot can hear her crying until his mom arrives. Mr. SEN talks to Elliot's mom and pays her back for the babysitting month. Elliot stops going to Mrs. SEN'S place after that, and his mom actually feels better about it. She gives him a key to the house, and from then on, he spends his afternoons alone. He wears a string with his house key around his neck. When his mom calls and asks if he's okay, he looks at the rough waves and tells her he's fine. In the short story, Mrs. SEN'S brings her traditions from India to America, such as her special curved knife and cooking techniques. She clings to her Indian background and finds it hard to adapt fully to American ways. For instance, she's emotional when hearing about her home country, and she uses red powder or vermilion in her hair as a symbol of tradition. Despite living in America, her sense of identity remains firmly rooted in India. Mrs. SEN'S journey as an immigrant is highlighted by her struggle to adapt to American ways. She initially finds it hard to drive and feels anxious on the road, emphasizing the frustrations of assimilating into a new society. Her resistance to driving represents her difficulty in fully embracing American practices, while her clinging to Indian traditions reflects the emotional aspect of the immigration experience. Mrs. SEN'S nostalgia for her homeland is evident in her longing for Indian traditions, food, fish, and the emotional reaction she has when hearing about India. She uses a tape recording to reminisce about her family in India and seeks comfort in her cultural practices. Her longing for home underscores the deep emotional connection she has with her native country. Elliot's mom values independence and personal responsibility, which leads her to send Elliot to Mrs. SEN for supervision. Mrs. SEN, on the other hand, emphasizes community and interdependence, reflecting her cultural background. Her question about whether anyone would respond if she screamed underscores the contrasting social values between her home country and America. It also highlights the desire for community bonding. Elliot's mother feels uncomfortable at Mrs. SEN'S apartment and rejects the food offered, which indicates a potential cultural misunderstanding. Mrs. SEN'S emotional attachment to her home country is difficult for Elliot to fully comprehend. The tale highlights the challenges of effective communication across cultural contexts. Both Elliot and Mrs. SEN experience feelings of loneliness and isolation. Elliot's beach house feels lonely and desolate during the cold season, and he prefers the warmth and companionship he finds at Mrs. SEN'S house. Mrs. SEN also feels isolated in America, missing the bustling community of her home country. She's alone in a quiet American environment, which contrasts with the communal and lively life she remembers in India. Despite their age difference, Mrs. SEN and Elliot develop a bond that bridges the generation gap. Mrs. SEN becomes a maternal figure to Elliot, while Elliot offers companionship and assistance. Through their interactions, they share stories and learn from each other, creating a unique and meaningful connection.